Without knowing she was his son's wife, the racist mother-in-law pushed her and struck her, saying, "How dare you enter my house, you stinking black woman?" And from the force of the impact, she had to be rushed for emergency care. Hours later, the mother-in-law paled when she learned that the woman had. Carmen walked slowly down the sidewalk, the cool afternoon breeze gently caressing her face while her right hand softly stroked her belly. She knew that today was an important day, not only for her, but for the life growing inside her. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions since she learned she was pregnant, and although Raphael, her husband, had been her unwavering support, today she felt an extra weight on her chest. She was about to meet her mother-in-law, Irene. With every step she took, her mind fluttered with thoughts of fear and uncertainty. She had never met Irene before, and Raphael had always been vague when they talked about her. "My mother is difficult," he had said on more than one occasion, without going into much detail. Carmen knew what that meant. It wasn't new to her to face disapproval. She had experienced it before, in other settings, with other people, but this time was different. This time, the disapproval would come from the mother of the man she loved. She took a deep breath when she reached the front door of the imposing house. The garden surrounding it was perfectly maintained, the flowers and shrubs trimmed with precision. Everything about Irene's house seemed to reflect the character of someone who controlled every aspect of her life with firm precision. Carmen swallowed hard and raised her hand, gently tapping on the carved wooden door. The sound of hurried footsteps behind the door put her on alert. She barely had time to prepare before the door swung open abruptly, revealing a tall woman with perfectly styled hair and a severe expression that froze the air around them. "Who are you?" Irene asked, her tone cold and calculated. Carmen tried to smile, attempting to calm the storm she felt building inside her. "I'm Carmen," she said softly, "Raphael's wife." Irene's face twisted in an expression of astonishment, but not the kind of astonishment that brings curiosity or joy, rather one full of contempt. "What are you saying?" Irene replied, her voice now sharper, cutting. "You? My son's wife? Don't you dare say that." Carmen felt the air grow heavier, the tension between them palpable. She instinctively took a step back, trying to find the right words. But before she could say anything more, Irene advanced toward her with eyes full of hatred. "Don't you dare step into my house, you stinking black woman." Irene spat, shoving Carmen forcefully toward the garden. Carmen fell on her back, feeling the impact on her body, but what alarmed her most was the sudden pain she felt in her belly. Terrified, she placed her hands on her abdomen as a wave of panic flooded over her. "No," Carmen murmured, her voice broken by pain and confusion. She could barely breathe, her body trembling as she tried to stand. Irene, still standing by the door, watched her with arms crossed, her gaze full of disdain. But Carmen could barely focus on the hateful words Irene continued spewing. The pain in her abdomen was growing more intense, and a sense of panic completely overtook her. She knew something was wrong, that her baby was in danger. "Help!" Carmen cried, her voice broken. "I need help." Irene's expression changed suddenly when she heard those words. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, but it quickly returned to its rigid state, as if she couldn't allow herself to show any vulnerability. "What are you doing?" Irene asked, her tone still severe, but with a shadow of unease in her eyes. "Don't try to trick me. I'm not falling for your games." Carmen curled up in pain on the ground. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. Her vision blurred, and she could barely move. The pain was unbearable, and every passing second she felt something terrible was about to happen. At that moment, a car sped up to the front of the house. Raphael rushed out, his face filled with concern. He had sensed from Carmen's call that something was wrong and decided to arrive earlier than planned. When he saw her on the ground, With Irene standing beside her, panic flooded him. "Carmen!" Raphael shouted as he ran to her, kneeling by her side and taking her hand. "What happened to you?" Carmen could barely speak. Her lips trembled, and tears flowed uncontrollably. "The baby!" "Raphael!" she murmured weakly, clutching her husband's hand tightly. Raphael, filled with desperation, looked at his mother with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What did you do, Mom?" he asked, his eyes full of rage. "Tell me what you did." Irene, still shocked by the situation, could barely articulate a response. Her face paled as she realized the gravity of what was happening. The words she had spat with such disdain now seemed to have turned into a poison that choked her. I didn't know," Irene stammered, her tone no longer confident but filled with a confusion that paralyzed her. "I didn't know she was. She's my wife," Raphael shouted. "The mother of your grandchild." Irene's face froze. Her grandchild. The reality of what had happened fell on her like a slab of concrete. Raphael, without waiting for a response, lifted Carmen in his arms, his body trembling with fear and desperation as he carried her toward the car. "I'm taking you to the hospital. Everything's going to be okay," Raphael whispered, his voice breaking as tears fought to come out. "Please, hold on." Irene stood there, watching as her son drove away, the weight of what she had done bearing down on her. She couldn't take her eyes off the scene, nor stop the whirlwind of emotions that consumed her. She felt trapped in her own mistake, in the irrational hatred that had led to this tragedy. Carmen, in Raphael's arms, closed her eyes as darkness began to envelop her, her body weak, but with the hope that somehow her baby could be saved. As the car sped toward the hospital, the air inside was thick with fear and love, a desperate love fighting to protect the life that was in danger. The chapter ends with Raphael's car speeding away from the mansion, leaving Irene behind, pale, knowing that her irrational hatred may have caused an irreparable tragedy. Raphael sped through the empty streets, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Carmen, who was breathing heavily, her hands still gripping her belly. He felt like the entire world was collapsing around him, and the helplessness was consuming him. How could something like this have happened? How could his own mother have caused so much pain? "Hold on, Carmen, please," Raphael whispered, though his voice sounded more like a desperate plea. "We're almost at the hospital." Carmen was trying to stay conscious, fighting against the pain that spread through her abdomen like fire. She couldn't stop thinking about her baby, wondering if it would be okay. Irene's words echoed in her mind, raw and filled with hate. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the life she carried inside her, the life she loved so much, even though she hadn't had the chance to meet it yet. Finally, they arrived at the hospital, and Raphael jumped out of the car, shouting for help. Several nurses immediately rushed over with a stretcher, quickly taking her inside. The chaos of the hospital was in stark contrast to the deathly silence he had felt at Irene's house. The hospital was filled with bright lights, voices, and the sounds of machines. But all of that faded in Raphael's mind as he could only think about Carmen and their baby. "Sir, we need you to stay here," said a nurse, trying to stop Raphael as he attempted to follow Carmen into the emergency room. "But I need to know if they'll be okay," Raphael shouted, tears filling his eyes. "She's my wife and my child." The nurse looked at him with empathy but didn't relent. "I understand, but let us do our job. We'll give you news as soon as we can." Raphael stood frozen in the hallway, watching as they disappeared behind the double doors. He collapsed into one of the chairs in the waiting room, his hands covering his face as he struggled to hold back the tears. It was the most terrifying moment of his life. He felt powerless, and fear consumed him completely. Meanwhile, Irene was alone in her house. After Raphael left with Carmen, the silence in the large home had begun to suffocate her. Her mind kept spinning, recalling every word she had said, every gesture of disdain toward that woman. And now, the reality of what she had done pierced her chest like a spear. She paced back and forth through the living room, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea, but she was unable to drink. Her son hadn't said anything more when he left, but his look, that look of fury and despair, haunted her. Irene had spent her entire life with deeply ingrained beliefs, a mindset inherited from her family. But now, for the first time, she was facing the possibility that those beliefs had not only isolated her, but had also caused irreversible harm. She sat on the couch, staring at pictures of Raphael as a child, and a sharp pain shot through her chest. She had done everything she could to protect her son, to give him the best. But in that moment, she realized she hadn't protected him from herself. "What have I done?" Irene whispered, her words choked with guilt. The phone in the living room began to ring, pulling her from her thoughts. Irene stared at it, unmoving at first. She was afraid it might be Raphael, afraid to face the consequences of what she had done. But finally, she got up and answered. "Hello?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Irene, it's Raphael." Her son's voice sounded broken, exhausted. "We're at the hospital. I don't know if Carmen and the baby are going to be okay." Irene felt her world collapse. The possibility that the grandchild she hadn't even known about might die because of her was a burden too heavy to bear. "Raphael, I'm sorry," Irene said, her voice cracking. I didn't know she was your wife. I didn't know about the baby." "That doesn't matter now, Mom," Raphael responded coldly. "What matters is that Carmen and our baby are fighting for their lives because of your hate, your prejudice. I don't know if I can forgive you." Irene felt the tears spill over. She had never seen her son so full of rage, and knowing that she was the cause tore her apart. "I want to go to the hospital," Irene said suddenly, feeling like she needed to do something, anything, to try and make things right. "I want to be there." There was a long silence before Raphael responded. "Do what you want, Mom, but I'm not sure you can fix this." The call ended, and Irene stared at the phone, her soul shattered. She knew that going to the hospital wouldn't undo what she had done, but she couldn't stay there, in that house that now felt like a prison of her own guilt. At the hospital, Raphael kept waiting for news. The minutes dragged by slowly, and the uncertainty was driving him crazy. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room and approached him. "Sir," the doctor said with a serious expression, "your wife is stable for now, but it was a big scare. The stress she experienced caused complications, but we are doing everything we can to ensure the baby is okay." Raphael felt a mix of relief and worry. Knowing that Carmen was stable was a small comfort, but the mention of complications with the baby filled him with fear. "Can I see her?" Raphael asked, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes. She needs to rest." Raphael followed the doctor to the room where Carmen was. When he entered, he saw her lying in bed, her eyes closed and her breathing slow. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and gently took her hand. "I'm here, Carmen," Raphael whispered, leaning close to her. "I'm so sorry. All of this is my fault." Carmen slowly opened her eyes, still weak, but the warmth in her gaze showed Raphael that she had heard him. She gently squeezed his hand, as if to reassure him, though she didn't have the strength to speak. "Don't worry about anything right now," Raphael continued, tears in his eyes. "I just want you to know I'm here, that everything's going to be okay. We'll get through this together." Carmen gave a slight nod, closing her eyes again as she tried to rest. Raphael sat beside her, not letting go of her hand, feeling that even though his world was on the verge of collapse, Just having her there with him was enough to give him strength. As the silence wrapped around the room, Raphael knew that his relationship with his mother had reached a breaking point. But now, his priority was Carmen and their baby. Nothing else mattered. Irene sat in the hospital's waiting room, surrounded by an overwhelming silence. The white walls, the whispers of the nurses, and the distant sound of medical monitors seemed to amplify the guilt consuming her. She was lost in her thoughts, her son's words still echoing in her mind. "I don't know if I can forgive you." The weight of that statement felt like a dagger piercing her soul. She had spent her entire life keeping her world under strict control, building barriers between herself and anything that challenged her beliefs or threatened her way of life. But now, facing the possibility that she had lost her son and grandchild because of her own hatred, Irene felt small, shattered. A doctor emerged from the emergency room and slowly approached Irene, who looked at him with eyes full of uncertainty. "Ma'am," the doctor said in a professional but empathetic tone, "your daughter-in-law is stable for now. It's been a difficult process, but the baby is still under observation. She needs to rest, and for now, all we can do is wait." Irene nodded wordlessly, swallowing the lump in her throat. She was about to thank him, but before she could respond, she saw Raphael coming out of Carmen's room. His eyes were tired, and although his face didn't show direct resentment, there was a palpable wall between them. Raphael stopped when he saw her. His emotions were a mixture of fury, pain, and, most of all, disappointment. For a moment, they stood in silence, both too wounded to know where to begin. Finally, it was Irene who spoke, her voice trembling, almost inaudible. "Raphael," she said, searching for words, feeling the need to explain herself even though she knew any explanation would be insufficient. I didn't know she was your wife, that you were going to be a father. I didn't know anything." Raphael looked at her, his eyes filled with deep exhaustion. He approached slowly, keeping enough distance to avoid any close contact. "Do you think that justifies what you did?" he asked, his voice tense but controlled. "Mom, it wasn't just what you said or what you did physically. It was the hate, the way you treated the person I love, the mother of my child. You can't say that not knowing makes it any less serious." Irene placed a hand on her chest, feeling the pain sink deeper into her heart. She knew Raphael was right. She knew her hatred had been blind, irrational, and that the words she had spoken had no justification, no matter what she thought. It was a pain she was only beginning to understand, one she didn't know how to fix. "You're right," Irene admitted, her eyes filling with tears she hadn't shed until that moment. "There's no excuse for what I did. I know that, but I swear I never meant to hurt you, or your family." Raphael looked at her for a few seconds, processing her words. He was hurt, but more than the pain, it was the sadness that overwhelmed him. He had never imagined his relationship with his mother would reach such a devastating point. "Mom," he finally said, his voice shaky, "I need time. I don't know how to move forward after this. Carmen, my child, you put everything at risk because of a prejudice you've always had. And I don't know if I can just leave that behind so easily." Irene lowered her gaze, understanding the gravity of what Raphael was saying. Time, that was the only response he could give right now. She knew she couldn't rush forgiveness, but she also knew she had to try to earn it, step by step. "I understand," she whispered, her voice almost faint. "All I ask is that you let me find a way to make this right, even though I don't know how yet. But I'll try." Raphael didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded slowly, turning his back and returning to Carmen's room, leaving Irene alone in the waiting room, drowning in her own thoughts. Carmen woke up slowly, feeling a numbness in her body, but her first thoughts were of the baby. Instinctively, she brought a hand to her belly, searching for a sign. a certainty that everything was okay. Beside her, Raphael watched with concern, paying attention to her every little movement. "You're okay, love," he said softly, taking her hand. "The doctors said we need to keep monitoring, but our baby is fighting, just like you." Carmen exhaled in relief, though her body still felt the impact of what had happened. She turned toward Raphael, her eyes searching for answers in her husband's tired face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "Is your mother here?" Raphael nodded slowly, knowing that sooner or later they would have to face that conversation. "Yes, she's here," he responded with a mix of sadness and anger. "She's remorseful, but I know that doesn't erase what she did to you. What she did to us." Carmen closed her eyes, tears starting to form. The pain was not just physical but emotional as well. Irene's cruel words still echoed in her mind, the image of her hateful expression as she pushed her. But at that moment, the most important thing to Carmen was their baby. Forgiveness, reconciliation, those could wait. "Raphael," Carmen whispered, gripping his hand tightly, "I don't want any of this to affect our child. I'll do whatever it takes to protect them, even if it means dealing with your mother." Raphael nodded, knowing that Carmen was making an incredible effort to stay strong. His love for her grew even more in that moment, but he also knew he couldn't ask more than she was already giving. "You don't have to worry about anything right now," Raphael said gently. "The most important thing is that you and our baby are okay. My mother, she'll have to face the consequences of what she did, but we won't let that break us." Carmen nodded but said nothing more. She let exhaustion take over, closing her eyes and allowing sleep to wash over her again. Irene was still in the waiting room, alone with her thoughts. Time passed slowly, and with every second, the weight of her guilt intensified. She knew she had to do something, that she couldn't just wait for things to resolve on their own. She got up from the chair and, with hesitant steps, made her way to the room where her son and Carmen were. She stopped in front of the door, hesitating. Did she have the right to enter? To face Carmen after everything she had done? Finally, with a trembling sigh, she softly knocked on the door. Raphael opened the door, his face a mix of exhaustion and sadness. The look they shared was brief, but enough for Irene to understand that, although the road to reconciliation would be long, this was the first step. She couldn't expect her son to forgive her immediately, but she was willing to earn that forgiveness, day by day. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Raphael nodded, without words, and stepped aside to let her in. Carmen was asleep, her face pale but peaceful. Irene approached the bed cautiously, observing the fragility of the situation. She sat in a chair beside her and, for the first time in a long while, let the tears flow freely. "I'm so sorry," Irene whispered, even though she knew Carmen couldn't hear her. "I can't undo what I've done, but I will fight to be better. For you, for Raphael, for my grandchild." And so, with her heart heavy with guilt and regret, Irene knew this was just the beginning of a long and painful healing process. But she was determined to walk that path, no matter how difficult it would be. The hospital, in its monotony of white lights and softly beeping machines, seemed indifferent to the emotional chaos surrounding Raphael's family. Carmen remained asleep, slowly recovering from the nightmare she had endured, while Irene sat in a chair beside the bed, struggling with her thoughts. The tears had stopped, but the knot in her throat remained. Her heart felt heavier than ever, weighed down with the guilt that even time didn't seem capable of easing. Raphael, who had remained silent for hours, observed the scene from a corner of the room. He didn't know what to do with the swirl of emotions tearing him apart. He loved his mother, but he was furious. He had respected her his entire life, but now her actions had placed her in a position where the admiration he once felt for her had crumbled. Still, The pain and regret on Irene's face were real, and while Raphael wasn't ready to forgive her, he knew his mother needed to be there just as much as he did. "Raphael," Irene whispered, breaking the silence, not daring to meet his eyes. "I don't know what to say to you. I don't know if I can ever do anything to make you forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm here. I won't leave until you tell me to." Raphael remained still, his gaze fixed on Carmen. He was so focused on her that he could barely process his mother's words. "It's not that simple, Mom," he finally responded, his voice tense. "You can't undo what happened. Things aren't going to go back to how they were." Irene lowered her head, unable to contradict him. She knew that her racism had poisoned more than just her relationship with Carmen. It had fractured Raphael's trust in her, and perhaps most painfully, had put her grandchild's life at risk. The truth was, Irene had lived for so long with a shield of prejudice that she had never stopped to question the harm those beliefs could cause. But now, faced with the possible loss of her family, everything was becoming clearer. "I know," Irene said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I did something terrible. I never stopped to think about what my hate, my prejudices, could mean. And now, I'm paying the price. But I want to change, Raphael. I don't know how, but I want to try." Raphael finally looked at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also a small spark of hope. "That's what I want to hear, Mom," Raphael said, his tone softer now. "I don't need empty promises or meaningless apologies. What I need is for you to change. And not just for me, but for you. Because this hate, it's consumed you for years. And look at what it's caused." Irene nodded slowly, feeling every word like an open wound. "You're right," she admitted. "I don't know how I let this hate blind me, but I'm here to learn. I'm here to prove that I can be better." The sound of a soft movement interrupted them. Carmen was beginning to wake up slowly. Raphael quickly moved closer, taking her hand as she opened her eyes, blinking with difficulty. "Carmen," he whispered, with a mix of relief and concern in his voice. "How are you feeling?" Carmen looked at him, her eyes still filled with exhaustion, but with a small glimmer of serenity. "I feel better," she said softly, while gently touching her belly, making sure the baby was okay. "Is the baby okay?" Raphael nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "Yes, the baby is fine. It was a big scare, but you're both safe." Carmen closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel a brief sense of relief. But when she opened them again, her gaze met Irene's, who remained seated on the other side of the room. An uncomfortable silence filled the air, and though Raphael tried to ease the tension, he knew this moment had to come. Irene stood up slowly, her heart pounding. She hadn't rehearsed what she would say, but she knew that whatever came out of her mouth had to be genuine. "Carmen," she began, her words trembling, "there's no way in this world to justify what I did to you. It doesn't matter what I thought before. What I did was monstrous, and I don't expect you to forgive me, not after everything I put you through. But I want you to know that I'm here to do what's right, to make amends in any way I can." Carmen looked at her with a mixture of pain and caution. She felt the weight of Irene's words, but also the damage they had caused. Her instinct to protect her child was mixed with the deep emotional wound Irene's words and actions had left. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Irene," Carmen said, her tone firm but tired. "Not after what you did, what you said. But I also don't want this hate to continue ruling our lives. I have to think about my child, about what's best for him." Irene nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I understand, Carmen. I just want a chance to prove to you that I can change. I know I don't deserve it, but please, for Raphael, for the baby, I want to do the right thing." Carmen looked at Raphael, searching for some sign of what to do, of how to proceed. Raphael, his eyes filled with sadness and hope, gave her a slight nod, offering her the freedom to make the decision she felt was best. Carmen took a deep breath. Her heart was still wounded, but she knew that hate wasn't the answer. She knew that her child would be born into a world where racism existed, where he would face challenges she herself had faced. But she also knew that if there was a chance to change something, to break the cycle, maybe it needed to start right there, in that hospital room, with the woman who had made the worst mistake of her life. "I don't know what this will look like," Carmen finally said, with a mix of firmness and vulnerability in her voice. "But I'm willing to try. Not for you, Irene, but for my son. Because I want him to grow up knowing that hate doesn't have power over our lives." Irene nodded, now crying openly. She knew she didn't deserve the generosity Carmen was offering, but she was determined to do whatever it took to show she could be a better person, a better mother, a better grandmother. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Carmen." Raphael, who had silently observed the entire scene, felt a mixture of relief and pain. He knew the wounds would take time to heal, but he also understood that this was the first step towards something better. He took Carmen's hand, and with the other, gently touched his mother's shoulder. The path to reconciliation was just beginning, and it wouldn't be easy. But in that moment, in that small space of hope, they all understood that while forgiveness wouldn't come immediately, they were willing to walk toward it together for the sake of the family they were building. And so, in that hospital, where pain and hope intertwined, a new opportunity for healing began to take shape. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting shades of orange and pink through the hospital windows. Carmen sat in her bed, her expression serene but tired, gently stroking her belly as she felt her baby move softly. Raphael was beside her, holding her hand carefully, his concern still visible on his face. Since they had moved past the initial crisis, the days had passed in a state of tense calm. Carmen's physical wounds were healing, but the emotional ones remained open. "How are you feeling?" Raphael asked quietly, breaking the silence around them. "I'm better," Carmen replied, smiling slightly as she looked at her belly. "I just want our child to be okay. Everything else can be worked out with time." Raphael nodded, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully eased. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about how quickly his life had changed, how his mother's irrational hatred had put everything he loved most at risk. And while he had spoken with Irene, and though she had shown remorse, Raphael was still struggling with the idea of rebuilding something with her. "My mother wants to come see you again," Raphael said, not taking his eyes off Carmen. "She says she needs to talk to you, beyond the apology she already gave. But I want you to know, you don't have to accept if you're not ready." Carmen looked at Raphael, understanding the internal battle he was fighting. She knew he was torn between his love for his mother and the need to protect his own family. She remained silent for a few moments, weighing the situation. "I'll let her come," she finally responded, her tone calm but firm. "Not for her, but for us. I don't want this resentment to become something that poisons our lives or our child's. If we don't face it now, it could turn into something bigger." Raphael nodded, admiring Carmen's strength. He knew she was doing this for everyone's sake, including his, and for a moment, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He leaned down and gently kissed her forehead, silently promising himself he would do everything to protect her. A few hours later, Irene arrived at the hospital. Her steps were cautious, and her face, though tired, showed a mixture of nerves and regret. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew nothing she could say would erase what she had done, but she also knew she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. Raphael met her in the hallway, and for a moment, mother and son stood in silence. Neither of them knew exactly how to act. The bond between them, once strong and solid, now felt fragile and filled with tension. "Thank you for coming, Mom," Raphael finally said. "But As I told you, this is up to Carmen. I can't force her to do anything. I know, son. Irene replied quietly. Whatever she decides, I'll accept. I want to try. Raphael led her into the room. As Irene crossed the threshold, she felt the air grow thick, heavy with unresolved emotions. Carmen was waiting for her, sitting on the bed. Though her posture was relaxed, her eyes reflected a mixture of vulnerability and caution. Irene hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to step forward. "You can come in," Carmen said, keeping her gaze fixed on Irene. "I want to hear what you have to say." Irene took a step forward, her heart in her throat. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words. She had played this moment in her mind hundreds of times since her last visit, but no amount of preparation felt like enough. "Carmen," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know where to start, but I want you to know that every day since it happened, I've thought about what I did, and I can't find any justification for my behavior. What I did was cruel, and I'm deeply ashamed of it." Carmen kept her gaze steady on Irene. There was no hatred in her eyes, but there wasn't an easy openness either. What had happened had left a deep wound, and while Carmen wasn't someone to hold on to grudges, she knew the process of healing would take time. "I didn't expect your apology to fix everything, Irene," Carmen replied with controlled calm. "But what I do expect is for you to understand that this isn't just between you and me. What happened, what you said, affects Raphael. It affects our son. I want to make sure that this cycle of hate doesn't continue because I don't want our child to grow up surrounded by the same." Irene nodded quickly, tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. She knew Carmen's words reflected her deepest fear, that her grandchild, a child she already loved even before birth, might suffer from the same pain she had caused. "That's what scares me the most, Carmen," Irene said, her voice breaking. "I'm afraid I've caused irreparable damage, that my grandson might one day see me as an enemy, as someone who doesn't value him for who he is. I don't want to be that person. I want to be better, for him, and for you both." Carmen listened in silence, feeling the weight of the moment. For the first time, Irene seemed to truly grasp the full impact of her actions. And while forgiveness wouldn't be easy or immediate, Carmen could see the sincerity in her mother-in-law's words. "I understand that you want to change, Irene," Carmen said after a few moments of reflection, "and I appreciate you being here. But change doesn't come with words. Change is shown through actions, and that's what I'm going to need to see over time. If you're willing to do that work, I'm willing to try as well." Irene took a deep breath, nodding. She knew she couldn't ask for more at that moment. She had hoped for a second chance, and Carmen was offering it, albeit cautiously. "I will, Carmen," Irene said with conviction. "I'll do everything I can to prove to you that I can be better, that I can be the grandmother your child deserves and the mother-in-law you need. I don't know how, but I'll learn." Carmen nodded slightly, feeling a small sense of relief. She knew the path to reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that hate couldn't rule her life or her child's. She was a strong woman, and though the scars would remain, she was determined to move forward toward a future where her family could be united. Raphael, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, stepped forward. He placed one hand on his mother's shoulder and the other on Carmen's. He didn't say anything, but his gesture was enough to convey his gratitude to both of them. The room remained silent for a few more minutes, a silence that, though heavy with emotion, was filled with hope. They knew there was much ahead, but in that moment, they all understood they were taking the first steps toward something new, something stronger. Outside the hospital, the sky continued to glow with warm hues as the sun set. It was a serene end to the day, a reflection of the calm that was slowly beginning to settle in the hearts of the family fighting to heal. The return home from the hospital was emotionally dense for Carmen and Raphael. Carmen, still weak but determined, felt that each step toward their front door symbolized a new beginning. However, she knew that the wound left by Irene wouldn't heal easily, even if both had agreed to try. Every everyday gesture, every prolonged silence, was charged with the recent history, the hurtful words, and the pain that still lingered in the air. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt larger and emptier than usual. Carmen sat down on the sofa, exhausted from the effort of moving after days of rest in the hospital. Raphael, always by her side, sat next to her in silence, wrapping his hand around hers. "It's good to be home, don't you think?" Carmen said, trying to smile, though her voice still carried the weight of the past few days. Raphael nodded, though his mind remained caught in the tension between his mother and his wife. He knew the road to reconciliation would be full of obstacles, and he couldn't shake the fear that the peace might be temporary. There were too many pent-up emotions, too many open wounds. "Yes, it's good to be here," Raphael responded, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "But if you need to talk about everything that's happened, you know I'm here." Carmen looked at him, grateful for his support. She knew that Raphael was carrying his own emotional burden, caught between the love for his mother and the need to protect his family. Despite everything, she felt that they had grown even closer through the chaos. "I know," Carmen murmured, "and I will talk. But right now, I just want to focus on us, on our child. We've been through so much. I just want to breathe a little peace, even if it's just for a moment." Raphael nodded and hugged her tightly, silently allowing her to rest. The soft pulse of their baby in Carmen's belly, a constant reminder of the life they were bringing into the world, gave him a sense of purpose, even in the midst of the storm. Irene, on the other hand, was facing her own internal battle. The solitude of her home, a place she had always considered her refuge, now felt like an emotional prison. She had spent much of her life building walls, distancing herself from what she didn't understand, and now those walls were suffocating her. Sitting in her favorite chair by the window, Irene watched the sunset, remembering the days when Raphael was a child. Everything had seemed simpler then, or at least that's what she thought. But now she realized she had been wrong for a long time, and the weight of that realization overwhelmed her. Determined not to remain a prisoner of her past, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of a close friend, Marissa, a woman who had always been there but whose friendship had been superficial. She knew she needed to talk to someone who could offer a different perspective. "Irene, dear, what a surprise to hear from you," Marissa said, her voice warm but surprised. "Marissa," Irene replied, her tone more hesitant than she had planned. "I need to talk to you. I don't know how to explain this, but I'm going through something I can't handle alone." Marissa was silent for a moment, sensing the gravity in Irene's voice. "Of course, Irene. Come over to my house. You don't have to face this alone." Irene felt relieved that she hadn't been turned away. She knew that to start healing, she would need to open up, something she hadn't done in many years. And although she feared judgment, she also knew she couldn't keep carrying the weight of her guilt without releasing it. The next day, Carmen and Raphael were trying to regain some normalcy in their home, though they knew the process would be slow. The baby continued to move in Carmen's belly, a constant reminder of what was at stake, and both focused on the small details of their daily routine to regain some stability. "I've been thinking," Carmen said, as she made tea in the kitchen, her gaze thoughtful, "about how we're going to raise our child in the midst of all this. I want them to grow up without hate, without that feeling that the world is against them, but I know it's going to be hard." Raphael moved closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It'll be hard, but we'll do it together. We're going to give him a home full of love, and that's what will matter. Things with my mom, they'll sort themselves out in time, I hope. But what matters most is that you and our child are okay." Carmen nodded, but her mind kept spinning. She knew Raphael was being optimistic, but there was a harsher reality they would both have to face. Their child would be born into a world that wouldn't always be kind. And while she would do everything in her power to protect him, she knew she couldn't control everything that happened outside their home. Just as the atmosphere was starting to relax, the doorbell rang, interrupting the moment of peace. Carmen and Raphael exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them was expecting visitors. Raphael went to open the door, and there stood Irene, looking both nervous and determined. Carmen, watching from the kitchen, felt a knot form in her stomach. She hadn't expected to see her so soon after their last conversation, and she wasn't sure how to react. "Mom," Raphael said, surprised. "We weren't expecting you." "I know," Irene replied, stepping forward, unsure. "But I've been thinking a lot, and I felt I needed to come. There's something I want to say to both of you." Carmen tensed, but slowly came out of the kitchen, keeping her eyes on Irene. "Come in," Raphael said, opening the door. "But are you sure this is the right time?" Irene nodded, and the three of them sat in the living room. The atmosphere was tense, but also filled with something new, something Carmen couldn't quite identify. Irene seemed different, more vulnerable, less sure of herself. And that, in some way, gave hope. "I've been talking to Marissa, my friend," Irene began, her voice trembling. "I told her everything that happened. She made me realize something I had never accepted before. I've lived with a hate I didn't understand, with a barrier toward people who don't look like me, who don't think like me. And while I don't know how to undo all the damage, I want to try. I know it won't be easy. I know I can't expect you to forgive me right away, Carmen, but I want to do what's right." Carmen listened carefully, sensing that, although the words were simple, they carried the weight of years of prejudice. There was something honest in Irene's tone, something she hadn't noticed before. "Irene," Carmen said finally, her voice soft but firm, "what matters is that you're here, and that you're willing to change. I don't know what our future will look like, but I want to believe it's possible to rebuild something." Raphael, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, felt a small spark of hope ignite in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to reconciliation. It wouldn't be easy, and the wounds would take time to heal, but in that moment, with the three of them together, it seemed possible. The afternoon passed with lighter conversations, and for the first time in a long while, the atmosphere in the house was no longer heavy. Though they knew the road ahead was still full of uncertainties, they all understood that they had taken a big step toward healing. As the sun began to set, casting soft golden hues across the room, Carmen, Raphael, and Irene exchanged glances, knowing that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still unwritten. And for the first time, that future seemed full of possibilities. The day had arrived. Carmen, sitting in a chair by the hospital window, watched as the first rays of sunlight lit up the city streets. It was a quiet morning, the kind of calm that seemed to envelop everything before a big event. She knew her life would soon change forever. In just a few hours, she would give birth to her child, the baby who had survived so much, who had brought her family together in an unexpected way. Raphael, who had never left her side, looked at her with a mix of admiration and love. Though their journey had been filled with dark moments, there was a light shining at the end of it all, and that light was about to enter their lives. "Are you nervous?" Raphael asked softly, as he took Carmen's hand and kissed it tenderly. Carmen smiled faintly, though a spark of anxiety flickered in her eyes. "A little, but it's not just about the birth. It's everything. The life we're about to start. I feel like we've been through so much, and now, in just a few hours, everything will be different. For the better, I hope." Raphael squeezed her hand tightly, giving her the reassurance he knew she needed. "It's going to be different, but it's going to be beautiful. We have our child, and we've worked to build a strong family. Nothing and no one will take that from us." Carmen nodded, letting herself be carried by Raphael's words. She knew that the love they shared, despite the challenges, had grown stronger over time. They had survived hate, prejudice, and now they were ready to welcome a new life. A few minutes later, Irene arrived at the hospital. Her steps were nervous, but her determination remained intact. Since her last conversation with Carmen, she had done everything possible to show through actions what words couldn't repair. She had stayed close, helping where she could, learning how to be a positive part of her son and Carmen's life. As she entered the room, Irene was greeted with a warm smile from Raphael and an understanding look from Carmen. She knew there was a fragility in all of this, but there was also hope. "Good morning," Irene said softly, keeping her voice calm. "How are you feeling, Carmen?" Carmen returned the smile, though with the obvious discomfort of a woman about to give birth. "A little nervous, but ready. I think I'm ready to meet our little one." Irene nodded, then moved closer to the bed, placing a hand timidly on Carmen's arm. "I want you to know that I'm so grateful you've given me this chance to be here. I'll never be able to thank you enough, but I'm here, ready to support you both in whatever you need. I want to be a part of your lives in the best way I can." Carmen looked at her with sincerity, knowing Irene's words were genuine. She had learned not to expect perfection, but dedication, and in Irene, she had found someone willing to transform her life. "Thank you, Irene," Carmen replied. "I no longer expect the past to disappear, but we can build something better. This baby is a new chance for all of us, and I want our child to grow up surrounded by love, not resentment." Irene nodded with tears in her eyes, feeling closer to Carmen than she had ever imagined possible. The next few hours passed in nervous laughter and quiet conversations. The doctors came and went, preparing everything for the birth, while the tension in the room seemed to ease as the moment drew closer. There was a silent connection between Carmen, Raphael, and Irene, as if the months of struggle and pain had led to this moment, one where they all understood what was truly at stake: a family. Finally, the time came. The doctors took Carmen to the delivery room, with Raphael by her side, offering all his support. Irene, though nervous, waited outside, feeling that her role in that moment was one of support, not center stage. But her heart pounded, knowing she was about to become a grandmother, an opportunity she had nearly lost. The labor was long, filled with moments of exhaustion and hope, but finally, the soft and fragile cry of the baby was heard. Carmen, with tears in her eyes, held him for the first time, feeling as if the entire world had stopped. It was her child, the baby she had waited for, the symbol of the struggle and love that had kept them together. Raphael leaned over her, kissing both their foreheads with tears in his eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Our little warrior." "He is," Carmen murmured, exhausted but filled with a joy she had never known before. Moments later, Irene was invited in. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw the little one in Carmen's arms, and though she said nothing at first, the love she felt was palpable. "You can hold him," Carmen said softly, looking at Irene. "He's your grandson, and I want you to meet him." Irene, moved to tears, approached slowly. Raphael carefully took the baby and placed him in his mother's arms. Irene held him with a tenderness she hadn't shown in a long time, as if she understood that this small being represented everything she had learned and still had to learn. "He's beautiful," Irene whispered, as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this." Carmen and Raphael exchanged a glance, and in that moment, without the need for words, they knew that the cycle of hate had been broken. It wouldn't be easy. Life would always present challenges, but they had achieved something extraordinary. Rebirth, not just in the life they held in their arms, but in the bond they had rebuilt. The sun began to set, casting warm hues across the room as the baby slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms. Carmen, exhausted but full of hope, lay back on the bed, smiling at Raphael. "This is just the beginning," Carmen said, her voice soft but full of conviction. Raphael nodded, holding her hand. "I know, and we're ready for whatever comes." Together, they watched as Irene cradled the baby, knowing that while the past couldn't be erased, the future they were building was full of possibilities. And in that moment, love, compassion, and forgiveness gave them a new beginning, one where hate had no place. The end of their story wasn't just the birth of a child, but the rebirth of a family that, having overcome pain and prejudice, was now ready to face the future with strength and unity. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep bringing you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative about to appear on your screen. We love having you with us, and you can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We've curated a selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.